If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story.
The storm outside raged with an unforgiving fury, its howling winds battering the rusted metal walls of the abandoned warehouse, rattling the loose sheets on the roof like a beast clawing to get inside. The rain came down in heavy sheets, leaking through the fractured ceiling, forming grimy puddles on the cold concrete floor where filth and blood had long dried into dark, unforgiving stains. The air inside was thick with the acrid stench of gasoline, alcohol, and something worse, something metallic, something that clung to the walls and to the very bones of the place. Blood. Death. Suffering. This was no ordinary hideout. This was a slaughterhouse for the forgotten, a graveyard for the discarded, a place where life had no value unless it could be wagered, beaten, or consumed. In the farthest corner, beneath the weak flicker of a single overhead light that swayed from a frayed wire, a rusted cage stood in shadows, its bars bent and corroded, its lock rusted but still holding fast. Inside, barely visible through the grime, a broken mother curled herself around the last fragile pieces of her soul. Valor, once a proud and noble canine police dog, lay trembling on the cold metal floor, her ribs pressing sharply through her thinning coat, her once powerful frame reduced to nothing more than skin, bone, and exhaustion. Her ears, once alert and proud, drooped lifelessly against her head, and her breathing came in slow, shallow gasps. But her body still held a purpose, a duty she would fulfill until her last breath. Beneath the protective curve of her body, nestled against her heaving ribs, were 3 newborn puppies, their fragile bodies trembling, their blind eyes searching, their tiny mouths opening and closing as they whimpered softly into the cold night air. They didn't know. They didn't understand that their mother was starving, that her body had nothing left to give, that the warmth they clung to was all she had left to offer them. They pressed against her, their tiny, fragile forms curling into the space where milk should have been, their soft cries piercing the darkness like a haunting melody of desperation. The smallest of them, barely larger than her paw, let out a weak, pitiful sound, a sound that should have never gone unheard, a sound that should have been met with warmth and safety, and the quiet lull of a home, not the echo of drunken laughter and the stench of impending death. But there was no warmth here. No safety, no home, only the steady hum of men who saw life as nothing more than something to own, to take, to destroy. Across the room, beneath the dim haze of cigarette smoke and flickering firelight, a group of bikers, clad in leather and cruelty, lounged around a makeshift table of old wooden crates and scavenged metal scraps. Their boots were caked in filth, their faces weathered and scarred, their hands marked with inked symbols that spoke of a life lived outside the laws of men. The Hellhounds, a gang feared not for their size but for their savagery, ruled these streets with bloodied fists and twisted smiles, taking what they wanted, destroying what they couldn't have, and leaving behind only the remnants of their pleasure in the form of discarded bodies and shattered bones. Tonight, they were celebrating. A bottle of whiskey passed from hand to hand, the sharp tang of alcohol filling the air as Reaper, the gang's second-in-command, leaned back in his chair, a jagged scar stretching across his jaw as he dragged a knife slowly across his palm, testing the edge with a smirk. His eyes flickered toward the cage, where the mother dog lay unmoving, her breathing ragged but steady, her eyes dull but still watching. "She's still alive?" he mused, tilting his head, amusement laced in every syllable. Didn't think she'd last this long. Tanker, the brute who had stolen her from the streets, chuckled darkly as he wiped a greasy hand across his shirt. "Canines don't go down easy," he mused, taking another swig from his flask. "They fight, they struggle, but in the end, they're just dogs." He turned his gaze toward the others, his voice lowering into something that carried weight, something that promised destruction. "And tonight, boys, we feast." The others laughed, the sound of it hollow, soulless, a collection of voices that had long since forgotten what mercy meant. A branding iron sat in the fire pit beside them, its metal already starting to glow, and above it, hanging from the rafters like a grotesque trophy, was a chain, thick, rusted, ready. They had done this before. They would do it again. And tonight, it would be her. The smallest of the puppies whimpered once more, a weak, broken sound that should have been met with a mother's comfort, but instead, it caught the attention of monsters. Reaper's eyes narrowed. "Those little shits are still breathing?" He pushed himself up from his chair, his boots clomping heavily against the concrete as he made his way toward the cage, his lips curling into something cruel, something hungry. He crouched low, his fingers curling around the rusted metal bars, his breath heavy with whiskey and smoke. "Ain't this sweet?" he murmured, his voice dripping with mockery as his eyes landed on the three trembling forms pressed against their mother's side. They still think she's gonna save them. Inside the cage, Valor tensed, her body locking up despite the pain, despite the exhaustion. She had no strength left, but if he touched them, if he so much as laid a finger on them, she would fight. Reaper smirked. He reached in. And then, she lunged. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. Her teeth found flesh, clamping down with everything she had left. Reaper's scream tore through the warehouse, a violent, rage-filled howl as he yanked his arm back, blood dripping from deep puncture wounds where her fangs had met bone. The room erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor as men jumped to their feet, fists clenching, weapons being drawn. Tanker grabbed a crowbar and swung. The first blow cracked against her ribs, sending a white-hot explosion of pain through her already fragile body. She didn't scream, she didn't whimper. She just collapsed, curling tighter around her babies. The second blow came harder. Her vision blurred. The sounds around her faded into something distant, something unreachable. The last thing she heard before darkness swallowed her whole was the sound of her puppies crying. Miles away, sitting inside a squad car, parked beneath the glow of a flickering streetlight, Officer Rachel Carter listened to the rain hammering against the windshield, her fingers drumming anxiously against the steering wheel. Something felt wrong. Her gut twisted as she replayed the conversation she'd had earlier that night. The anonymous tip about a special dog being used for something sick, something violent, something final. She had called dispatch. They had told her to stand down. She wasn't going to. With a steady hand, she reached for her weapon, her badge, her Kevlar vest. She had no warrant, no backup, no time. But somewhere out there, in the darkness and the storm, a mother and her children were waiting for a savior. And she was going to be it. Tonight, justice would be served. The storm had not relented, and neither had the darkness that shrouded the warehouse. A hollowed-out skeleton of rusted metal and forgotten ruin. A place where hope had never set foot, where mercy was a word long erased from existence. The wind howled through the jagged holes in the roof, rattling the loose chains hanging from the rafters, creating a metallic symphony of dread, a sound that echoed the hollow emptiness within the walls, where life was nothing more than a commodity to be wagered, tormented, or thrown away. The stench of filth and death clung to every surface, thick and suffocating. The kind of smell that seeped into the walls, the floors, and the bones of anyone who had the misfortune of standing within its grip for too long. It was the scent of a place that had long abandoned its right to be part of the living world. And at its very core, in the dim glow of a flickering overhead bulb, lay a mother's dying hope. Valor, once a proud warrior, a K9 whose very presence had struck fear into criminals and comfort into those she had sworn to protect, lay in the filth of her rusted cage, broken but unyielding, battered but still breathing. Every breath was a struggle, a slow and painful reminder that she had lost too much blood, that her body had endured too much cruelty, that the strength she had once known had been reduced to nothing but a fading ember. But still she moved. Still, she shielded them. Her ribs burned with each inhale, her side throbbing where the crowbar had cracked against her, bruises already forming beneath the thin stretch of her fur. The world around her was pain, a never-ending cycle of agony and helplessness, but none of it compared to the torment of hearing her children cry. The smallest of the three pups, a fragile, trembling thing with a barely there heartbeat, let out a broken whimper, its tiny body pressing closer to its mother's unmoving chest, seeking warmth, seeking food, seeking life. But she had none left to give. Their cries were soft, pitiful, the sound of innocence begging to be saved in a world that had already decided to let them die. And outside the cage, where men had gathered, where laughter and whiskey slurred together in a chorus of heartless celebration, there was no one who cared. Reaper. his wounded wrist wrapped in a blood-stained rag, paced with a slow, simmering fury, the kind that lingered, the kind that burned hotter the longer it was left to smolder. His pride had been wounded more than his flesh, and that alone was enough to warrant punishment, to demand retribution for the audacity of a dying animal to fight back, to remind him that for even a moment, she had still had the will to resist. That would change. Tanker sat on a makeshift crate, watching him with an amused smirk as he took another long drink, the fire pit beside them crackling with the first embers of what would soon be the mother dog's funeral pyre. The branding iron, its end glowing a deep, angry red, rested against the side of a rusted barrel, the heat rising from its tip in slow, taunting waves. "She's still got some fight in her," Tanker mused, dragging the back of his hand across his bearded jaw as he watched Valor's cage with something between satisfaction and boredom. Might be fun to drag it out a little longer. Reaper gritted his teeth, his hand tightening around the knife at his belt. "I say we start now," he growled, his anger overriding his patience, his thirst for revenge overriding whatever morbid pleasure could be drawn from prolonging the inevitable. "She wants to fight? Fine. Let's see how much fight she's got left when I cut her open and watch her little brat starve right in front of her." The room erupted with laughter, the kind that slithered under skin, that made the walls feel smaller, that turned the air heavier. None of them saw the shadow that had begun to move in the storm outside. She moved. Rachel Carter had never been the kind of officer who waited for permission to do the right thing. She had never been one to sit back and watch as lives were taken, as justice was delayed, as monsters roamed free under the thin veil of legal red tape that too often let the worst of them slip through its grasp. And tonight, she wasn't waiting. The warehouse loomed ahead, a blackened husk against the rain, its exterior riddled with rust and decay, its entrance guarded only by the assumption that no one would dare enter. They were wrong. Rachel cut the engine of her squad car a few yards away, the darkness swallowing her in its embrace as she pulled the hood of her jacket up against the rain, her fingers tightening around the grip of her Glock 19, its familiar weight grounding her in the chaos of what she was about to do. She had no backup, no jurisdiction, no warrant, only the knowledge that if she hesitated, even for a moment, it would be too late. She moved quickly, silently, her boots splashing through the mud as she pressed herself against the side of the building, her breath controlled, her pulse steady. Through the shattered glass of one of the high windows, she could see them. The bikers gathered in their circle of filth and bloodlust, their backs turned to the cage that held the only lives that mattered tonight. And then she heard it. The softest, weakest cry. A sound so fragile, so small, that it shouldn't have been heard over the roar of the storm. But she heard it, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Inside the warehouse, Reaper had turned back to the cage, his grip tightening around the knife, his knuckles white with anticipation. He was going to enjoy this. The doors burst open. A thunderous crack split the air as Rachel fired the first shot, her bullet tearing through the whiskey bottle in Tanker's hand, sending shards of glass exploding across the room. The bikers reacted on instinct, reaching for their weapons, scrambling to their feet, their shouts rising in panic and fury. But Rachel was already moving. The second shot sent the fire pit tumbling over, the flames licking at the concrete as embers scattered across the floor, the branding iron clattering against the ground with a deafening clang. "Drop your weapons, hands in the air!" Rachel's voice rang out, strong, unwavering, the voice of someone who had already decided that she wasn't leaving here without them. Reaper turned, his knife still in hand, his face twisted into something dark, something dangerous. "You got a death wish, lady," he sneered, his grip adjusting on the blade. Rachel's gun didn't waver. "That dog and her pups are coming with me." Reaper smirked. "You really think you're walking out of here alive?" Rachel took a step forward, her gun aimed directly at his chest, her finger tight against the trigger. "Try me." A moment of stillness, a moment where the world held its breath. And then Reaper moved. Rachel fired. The warehouse erupted into hell. The gunshot echoed like thunder within the warehouse. A single, decisive crack that shattered the chaos into something sharper, more dangerous. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to slow. the air thick with the scent of burning whiskey and rain-drenched metal. The fire pit's embers still glowing on the concrete like dying stars. Rachel Carter stood her ground, her Glock held steady, her breath even despite the pounding adrenaline surging through her veins. Across the room, Reaper staggered back, the bullet grazing his shoulder, tearing through the leather of his jacket and sending a sharp burst of crimson splattering across the floor. He hissed through his teeth, his free hand gripping the wound, but the sneer never left his face. If anything, the pain only excited him. "You just made the worst mistake of your life, lady," he spat, his voice laced with both fury and amusement. Rachel didn't respond. She didn't need to. The cold focus in her eyes, the unflinching way she leveled the gun at his chest, was answer enough. The other bikers, momentarily stunned by the sudden violence, snapped into motion. Tanker was the first to react, lunging for the rifle propped against the wall, but Rachel was faster. Another shot rang out. The bullet struck the weapon's stock, sending it skidding across the floor. "Next one goes through your skull." Rachel's voice was steel, unyielding, a promise rather than a threat. Tanker hesitated, his lips pulling back in an animalistic snarl, but he didn't move toward the gun again. Instead, his gaze flicked toward Reaper, waiting for orders. Reaper exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, his eyes flicking toward Rachel's gun, toward the fire still burning in the pit, toward the cage where Valor lay unmoving. His smirk widened. "You came here for the dog," he mused, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "That's what this is all about, right? Some bleeding heart cop getting herself killed over a fucking mutt." Rachel's grip on the gun tightened. "That dog has more honor in her bones than all of you put together," she bit out. Reaper laughed. "Honor? She's food." Rachel fired again. The bullet whistled past his ear, burying itself in the wooden crate behind him. The message was clear. She was done talking. Everything erupted at once. Reaper lunged. Rachel twisted out of the way just as his knife slashed through the air, barely missing her ribs. Her training kicked in. Years of self-defense, years of taking down bigger, stronger men in alleys and back streets, years of knowing that hesitation meant death. She pivoted, driving her elbow into his jaw. He stumbled back, cursing, but another biker was already moving. Tanker charged like a bull, his fists swinging. Rachel ducked low, narrowly avoiding the impact, but she couldn't dodge forever. She needed space. She needed to get to Valor. A crate shattered behind her as Tanker's fists slammed into it instead of her skull. Rachel's eyes darted toward the cage, toward the 3 tiny, whimpering puppies still pressed against their mother's broken body. With a sharp twist, Rachel dodged past another attack, grabbing a rusted metal pipe from the ground. She swung, hard, the impact cracking against Tanker's ribs. He roared in pain, staggering, but he wasn't down. Reaper recovered, wiping the blood from his lip, his expression twisting into something hungry. "Boys," he called, his voice dripping with dark amusement. "Let's teach this bitch what happens when you come into Hellhound territory." Rachel's stomach dropped. She could handle 1. Maybe 2. But 6. They began to surround her, and she was out of bullets. In the cage, in the filth and the blood, Valor heard everything. Her body was broken. Her bones felt like lead. Every breath was agony. But she had spent her whole life fighting, and she wasn't going to die while her children screamed. Slowly, painfully, she moved. Her paws trembled as she shifted, as she forced herself to rise. Her vision blurred, the world spinning around her, but she focused on one thing. The woman. The fight. Rachel had come for her. Rachel had fought for her. And Valor would fight too. With a low, guttural snarl, she staggered forward. The pain be damned. The bikers heard it. Reaper turned toward the cage just as Valor lunged, slamming her body against the rusted bars, her fangs snapping. Rachel didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest crate and threw it at the lock. It shattered. The cage swung open, and then everything changed. Valor exploded out of the cage. She wasn't the same fragile creature that had lain broken on the floor minutes ago. She was a canine, a warrior, a mother with nothing left to lose, and she was out for blood. Reaper barely had time to react before she was on him. Her teeth sank into his forearm, the same one she had wounded before, and this time she didn't let go. She ripped, tore, her jaws crushing through muscle, through tendon. He screamed. Rachel moved at the same time, driving her elbow into Tanker's throat, grabbing the fallen gun from the floor. The bikers tried to fight. They failed. Because Valor was a soldier and Rachel was a force of nature, and together they were unstoppable. One by one, they fell. Tanker collapsed, choking on his own breath. Another man hit the floor, his nose shattered. Reaper screamed, clutching his mangled arm, his body convulsing as Valor tore into him. And then, silence. Heavy breathing. The sound of rain hammering against the roof. Rachel stood in the wreckage, her chest heaving, her body aching. Blood, not hers, dripped from the corner of her mouth. At her side, Valor stood panting, her muzzle coated in red, her legs shaking. They had won. But it wasn't over yet. Rachel turned toward the cage, toward the 3 tiny trembling lives still curled together, still waiting. They had fought for them, and now they had to get them out. Rachel moved first, stepping over the bodies, kneeling before them. Slowly, carefully, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the smallest pup. It whimpered, curling into the warmth of her palm. Rachel's breath caught, and Valor, despite everything, despite the pain, despite the blood, laid her head against Rachel's knee and sighed. The battle was over, the war had been won, and the babies, they would live. The warehouse reeked of blood, burnt whiskey, and the smoldering remnants of embers that still clung to the overturned fire pit, their orange glow casting eerie shadows against the rusted walls. The storm outside had not let up. The pounding rain against the tin roof, a relentless reminder that the night was far from over. The battle had been won, but the war, the true fight for survival, was just beginning. Rachel Carter crouched in the middle of the wreckage, her breath heavy, her gun still clutched tightly in her hands, her knuckles white from the sheer force of her grip. Around her, the bodies of the Hellhounds lay motionless, some groaning in pain, others unconscious, their reign of terror broken by a storm far greater than the one outside. But she had no time to revel in victory, no moment to breathe in the satisfaction of watching those men crumble beneath the weight of their own brutality. Because she wasn't here for them. She was here for the mother and her children. Valor stood at her side, her ribs rising and falling with labored breaths, her once magnificent frame battered and weak, but still standing. Blood, most of it not her own, dripped from her jowls, staining the filth beneath her paws, but her amber eyes never left the 3 tiny, shivering bodies still curled in the cage, their soft whimpers barely audible over the chaos that had preceded this moment. They didn't understand what had happened, didn't know that their world had nearly ended tonight, didn't know that the only reason their hearts still beat was because their mother, a warrior, a protector, a soldier long before she was a mother, had fought for them even when her body had nothing left to give. Rachel swallowed the tightness in her throat, forcing herself to move, to act. "We need to get them out of here," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. Valor understood. Despite the exhaustion, despite the pain radiating through every inch of her broken body, she turned, limping toward the cage, her eyes locked onto her puppies as she pressed her muzzle against them, her breath shaky but softer now, gentler, the way a mother's should be. Rachel knelt beside them, ignoring the aches in her muscles, ignoring the distant echoes of sirens. She had called them before she entered, knowing she might not make it out, knowing someone would have to clean up the bodies she left behind. The others would be here soon, but she wouldn't let them take Valor or her babies. No one was going to separate them now. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the smallest of the pups, her fingers barely brushing against its fragile body before it whimpered and curled deeper into its mother's warmth. A sharp pang of something, guilt, pain, pierced through Rachel's chest. The puppy didn't trust her. None of them did. And why should they? The only world they had ever known was cold metal, cruelty, starvation. Rachel had been raised to believe she could save everyone, that justice was a force that could heal wounds if only it was wielded by the right hands. But justice had never come for Valor. Justice had never come for these babies. All they had ever known was injustice. Rachel clenched her jaw, her fingers curling into fists as she blinked away the heat behind her eyes. "Well," she murmured softly, "I guess I'll just have to earn it." Outside, the world was unraveling. The storm had worsened, the wind howling against the walls of the warehouse, rain slamming into the tin roof in violent sheets, But that wasn't the only threat looming in the distance. Sirens. Distant. Growing closer. Rachel had expected them. Had known the moment she pulled the trigger that the cavalry would arrive soon, that someone would come looking for the source of the violence she had unleashed upon this place. But what she hadn't anticipated was the sudden shift in the shadows, the slow, wheezing breath behind her. Reaper wasn't dead. A low, guttural chuckle filled the air, a sound laced with blood and venom. Rachel froze. Too late. The knife came first. A flash of steel, the searing pain of cold metal slicing through her shoulder. Rachel gritted her teeth, biting back the scream, refusing to give him the satisfaction of hearing it. Instead, she turned, twisting her body with all the force she could muster, slamming her elbow into his already broken nose. Reaper stumbled back, choking on his own blood, but he wasn't done. His eyes, wild, crazed, filled with something beyond hatred now, flickered toward the open cage. Rachel knew what he was thinking before he even moved. Not the mother. The puppies. He lunged. Rachel reacted on instinct, ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder, ignoring the blood soaking into her sleeve, ignoring everything except the singular, absolute fact that she would rather die than let this man touch them. Her body crashed into his, sending them both sprawling to the ground. His knife clattered across the floor, spinning away into the darkness. But Reaper was stronger, his hands wrapped around her throat, pressing down, crushing. Rachel saw stars. She struggled, kicked, clawed, but his grip was relentless, his weight bearing down on her like a death sentence. "Should have stayed out of this, cop," he snarled, his breath hot and reeking of whiskey and rage. "You ain't leaving this place." Rachel's vision blurred, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming, and then the weight lifted. A flash of teeth. A blood-curdling scream. Reaper howled in agony, his grip releasing as a powerful force tackled him from behind, sending him crashing to the floor. Rachel gasped for air, choking, rolling onto her side, coughing violently as she struggled to sit up. And then she saw her. Valor. The mother. The soldier. The protector. She stood over Reaper's writhing body, her broken, battered frame trembling from exhaustion. Her breathing labored. Blood dripped from her jowls, staining the ground, staining her fur, but her eyes, God, her eyes, burned with fury. She had saved Rachel. Rachel had come here to save Valor, but in the end it was Valor who had saved her. And Reaper, the monster who had tormented her, the man who had nearly stolen everything from her, would never hurt anyone again. Rachel didn't need to check his pulse. She knew. The sirens were close now. Rachel pressed a hand to her bleeding shoulder, pushing herself up, her legs trembling, exhaustion seeping into every bone. She turned toward the cage, toward the tiny, trembling puppies who had witnessed everything, whose tiny bodies still quivered from fear. She stepped forward. This time when she reached for them, they didn't pull away. They let her hold them. Rachel exhaled. She turned back to Valor, her chest tight, her throat burning with something unspoken, something she didn't have words for. Valor pressed her head against Rachel's side, closing her eyes. It was over. They were safe. For the first time, the mother could rest. Rachel gathered them up, one by one, tucking them carefully against her chest, cradling them as though they were the most precious things in the world. And maybe they were. As the first police cars skidded to a stop outside the warehouse, as the red and blue lights painted the storm in flashes of color, Rachel walked forward, a mother and her children in her arms. A mother who had survived hell. A mother who would never be alone again. The hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the soft hum of rain against the window. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world drenched in a cold gray dawn, a city awakening from the darkness of the night before. Rachel Carter lay still, exhaustion pressing into every fiber of her being, her body aching from the weight of battle. Her shoulder was tightly bandaged, the wound stitched but still throbbing, a dull reminder of how close she had come to not making it out of that warehouse. She had spent the last few hours answering questions, recounting events, watching as the bodies of the Hellhounds were loaded into black bags, as the last remnants of that nightmare were erased from the world. But the only thing she had truly cared about, the only thing that had mattered, was whether they had made it. A soft sound stirred from the corner of the room. Rachel turned her head slowly, and there they were, Valor, She was lying on a soft blanket, her battered body curled protectively around her 3 tiny puppies, her breathing slow, steady, deep. The pain was still there, the scars would never fade, but in that moment, she was at peace. For the first time, she was safe. And her children were alive. Rachel felt the sharp sting of tears pressing behind her eyes as she watched the smallest pup, the one that had barely clung to life, the one that had whimpered through the entire night, stretch out a tiny paw and press it against its mother's muzzle. Valor responded with a soft nuzzle, her tongue flicking out to soothe it, to tell it, in the only way she knew how, that everything was going to be okay now. Rachel blinked rapidly, swallowing the emotion that threatened to choke her. How cruel the world had been to them, how senseless, how merciless. How many nights had Valor suffered in silence? How many days had she withstood the agony of starvation, the fear of knowing that her children might never live beyond the cold bars of that cage? How many times had she wanted to give up, only to push forward because she knew she couldn't afford to? Because mothers didn't get to give up. A lump formed in Rachel's throat as she forced herself to sit up, ignoring the protest of her body. She needed to touch them, needed to feel for herself that they were real, that they were warm, that they were still breathing. She swung her legs off the side of the hospital bed and slowly, carefully made her way to the blanket where they rested. Valor lifted her head, her amber eyes meeting Rachel's with something unspoken, something profound. For the first time since that night, Rachel smiled. She reached out, hesitating just for a moment before running her fingers gently over Valor's scarred forehead, tracing the path of suffering, of survival, of resilience. And Valor, the warrior, the soldier, the mother who had fought against death itself, leaned into her touch. Rachel let out a slow, shaky breath, feeling something break inside her, something she hadn't even realized she had been holding on to. She had saved so many lives throughout her career, had stopped criminals, had protected victims, had done her duty as an officer of the law. But she had never done something like this. She had never felt something like this. It was different when you looked into the eyes of the one you saved and saw not just gratitude, but trust. A kind of trust that could never be repaid. A warm, wet nose nudged against her wrist. Rachel looked down to find the smallest puppy sniffing at her fingers, its tiny body trembling, its blind eyes searching. Her heart shattered. She reached down, lifting the fragile thing into her hands, cradling it against her chest. It was so small, so light, nothing but a fragile breath of life. But it was here, it was alive. She had done that. She had given it this chance. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, and this time she let them fall. She bent her head and pressed a soft kiss against the puppy's tiny forehead. "You're safe now," her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe, I promise." Days turned into weeks, and the scars of that night began to fade, though they would never fully disappear. Rachel's wound healed, but it left a mark, a thin reminder of the night she had chosen to break the rules, the night she had nearly lost everything in the name of something greater. The warehouse had been seized, the Hellhounds dismantled, their empire of cruelty crushed beneath the weight of their own brutality. But none of that mattered to Rachel, because her world was here now. In a small, quiet house just outside the city, with Valor and her 3 tiny miracles. She had taken them in without hesitation, had spent long nights nursing Valor back to health, making sure she ate, that she had warmth, that she had everything she had once been denied. The puppies grew stronger each day, their once frail bodies now full of energy, their tiny tails wagging wildly every time Rachel walked through the door. But it was Valor who had changed the most. She was still fierce, still sharp-eyed and protective, but now there was something softer in her gaze, something lighter in the way she carried herself. She no longer looked over her shoulder, no longer flinched at every sound. Because she knew she was home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light through the windows, Rachel sat on the floor, Valor lying beside her, her puppies curled up between them. The smallest one, the one who had first feared her, who had once pulled away, now slept against her lap, its tiny breath slow, steady, safe. Rachel ran her fingers through Valor's thick fur, her throat tightening. "You saved my life, you know," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came there thinking I was saving you, But in the end, you saved me." Valor let out a soft sigh, nudging her head against Rachel's shoulder. And in that moment, Rachel knew that whatever pain they had endured, whatever injustice they had faced, whatever horrors had been written into their past, none of it mattered anymore. Because here, in this home, in this quiet place where love was louder than the ghosts of yesterday, they had finally won. Rachel closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against Valor's, a silent promise, a forever kind of vow. "You are safe, you are loved, you will never be alone again." And for the first time in her life, Valor believed it.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.